Hi, everyone, and welcome again to another one of my Gaudium et Spes podcasts and YouTube videos. And I'm very pleased that we finally have on the show today Dr. Timothy Flanders, uh, who is the editor of 1 Peter 5. And we've been trying to get this interview scheduled for several months now, but first things came up on my end, then things came up on his end, and all of a sudden we were, months behind. So we're finally here doing this interview, and it's very timely because Timothy has out a new book, City of God, City of Man. And it's full disclosure. Usually, when I interview a guest about a book of theirs, I will have at least already gotten the book and read big chunks of it before I do the interview. But because of this injury that I have suffered to my leg and abdomen, which is thankfully healing, I have just been behind the eight ball, behind the curve. Those of you who follow my blog notice that there's been a bit less production lately. Painkillers have made me a little bit groggy. So anyway, I'm a little bit disadvantaged. I'm embarrassed to say that I have not yet purchased Timothy Flanders' book or therefore read it. But I have read reviews of it. Let's put it that way, and they give it good reviews. And so I'm very pleased to talk to it. And I get from the reviews that the essence of the book is that uh, we face today a grave crisis in the church, perhaps one of the gravest crises in the history of the church. It's both a cultural crisis and a cultural crisis that has bled into the church. This is also a main theme in my own recent book published by Ignatius Press, Confession of a Catholic Worker. And Timothy Flanders puts forth the proposition that, traditionalists and then communio resourcement theologians like myself need to sort of join hands across the aisle in order to sort of make common cause in the midst of this crisis. Am I characterizing the essence of the book properly, or do you want to? And even if I am, do you want to add to that? I'm going to turn it over to you now to give us the essence of your book, why you wrote it, why it's important, what's it saying, why we should give a darn, and why it's the greatest book that was ever written and everybody should read it. So let's go.
Yes, of course. Well, first of all, full disclosure is that I am not a doctor. In fact, I do not have a PhD. I
Oh,
didn't
that's
I
right.
didn't even finish my master's degree because I had to make money to provide for my wife and children, so I quit
Well,
that.
it's
But at
perhaps
the
it's a mistake easily made because you carry your erudition well. So there you
well,
go.
thank you very much. So this text was going to be my dissertation. That was the plan, but turns out it's just going to be a book. So no dissertation, but here you go. Here's a book. So yeah, so the
Hey, but
the
wait a minute. Wait,
yes.
Timothy, wait before you get it. Perhaps now that I have reached such heights of august splendor here at GaudiumEtSpes22.com, perhaps I now have the right to confer honorary doctorates. So you we'll give you an honorary Gaudium et Spes 22 doctorate today.
Wow,
How's
you
that?
are really reaching across the aisle to me, who's
Well,
a rabid rad trad. So I'm
yeah. Well, I don't know how
kudos to
rabid
you.
you are, but anyway, I keep interrupting you. Once again, that's just further evidence I'm kind of out of it these days. But I am very pleased to have you as a guest, and very pleased to talk about your book. So,
Yeah,
without interruption, without further ado, your book, sir.
sure. Well, essentially, yes. Of course, we need to join hands across the aisle against the machinations of the enemies of Christ and the fallen angels and all sorts of things that are going on today in society. My book presents a synthesis of the spiritual history of culture, which is an attempt to synthesize St. Augustine into his greatest 20th century disciple in history, at least, is Christopher Dawson,
Yeah,
and to provide a hypothesis about this spiritual history of culture, and in particular, the development of doctrine within that through the whole 2000-year history of the church, which contextualizes our current crisis, which provides a spiritual, cultural, theological justification behind that communion on the one hand and trial on the other side. I view the work of Vatican I and the work of Vatican II as God bringing us towards this higher synthesis, which is ultimately a response to modernity and liberalism and all of her ugly daughters like feminism and Marxism. And so it is a very broad history, but it is focused on presenting something which is a new hypothesis about the current crisis that we face. So providing a 2,000-year justification for that joining of hands, and a hypothesis as to where we're going with that, and where this is leading us. And this is right in line with what you said in one of your recent essays. It was contained in Kwasniewski's volume about Vatican II 60 years later, and how you
Yeah.
talk about Matthew Levering, Matthew Meinert, and how they're working towards this very thing, which is a theological synthesis between sort of the Neo-Thomists and then the Ressourcement. And then my book provides that is the kernel. That's really the cultus. That's the cultus, which is the epicenter of culture, out of which flows culture. But then it is also all of the other aspects of culture and society, family, economics, and all those things that flow therefrom.
Oh man, that is really something. And based on the reviews that I've read and some of the blurbs, people think that you were very, very successful at pulling that project off. I can't wait to get the book and read it now. So an immediate question always comes to me when I read books like this or hear about books like this that are trying to address the cultural crisis and the ecclesial crisis of today by going back and doing a deep sort of retrieval of the tradition in various ways. And I often want to ask the question, is this book a bit back engineered in the sense that does it begin with a fundamental insight that we face this horrific crisis today, which I want to talk about and unpack more? And then you beginning with the awareness of crisis, you then sort of back engineer, well, how did we get to this crisis? How did we get here? So I mean, in other words, I'm always looking for why an author felt so motivated to write a text. What is it that this author most really is animated by? And in my own case, in my own book, it began with awareness of crisis. And then I back engineered, well, how did we get here and what are the remedies? So, I mean, so in other words, is the emphasis on the book more a kind of academic unpacking of the history of a kind of Augustinian, Dawsonian approach to things? Or is it really a combination of that sort of academic analysis with a true sort of existential sort of stabbing at this crisis that we are in today?
Yeah, I would say it is both of those things. And just to answer your main question, is that for me personally, this is really the fruit of 10 plus years of research in which
Yeah.
brought me out of Protestantism and then into various Messianic Jewish theories, and then into Eastern Orthodoxy, and then ultimately into Roman Catholicism. So it's actually a really an apologetic for all the for Roman Catholicism above all
Yeah.
those things, which really synthesizes all of the truth of all those things, and then denies all their errors. So that's what motivated me personally. That's not really explicit in
Right.
the book, but it's part of it is so looking at this through the lens of Augustine and Dawson, and looking at our current crisis, and then yes, looking at what are the different things that led to that, because I think that one problem is that people in the current crisis who fall into different camps
Yeah.
tend to ideologize history. So they take history. So, for example, and the most common one is, from a trad perspective, you say, oh, well, everything was fine and dandy before Vatican II, and then Vatican II, and then destroyed everything. And
Yeah.
obviously there is a truth to that, but it's ideologizing history. There's way more that goes on with that, way more things that need to be unpacked there. There's roots, historical causes and roots that go back centuries and centuries. There's the issue, very huge issues that are coming out in the 19th century, ecclesiology, and the dominance of Neo-Thomism, the sort of no salvation outside Thomism atmosphere that was created. Anyways, there's all sorts of different
Yeah.
things. So yes, so it's attempt to pull at all the strings and try to unpack and unravel all these ideologies, the ideologies of history, to say, well, there's actually so many different factors going on that we can't just put one factor, People want to just blame one thing or put a scapegoat in that and whatnot. But so that's one aspect. But the other aspect is looking at sort of the spirit of Christendom and the spirit of doctrinal development, which is really the Holy Spirit, but observing how the Holy Spirit works in these different things. And it's what I call, it was in my most recent lecture on the topic was it's the Greco-Roman Christendom, but that the church has a Greco instinct, which is kind of like an instinct for something new, some new thing, as we read in the book of Acts about how the Greeks have this sort of instinct towards philosophy and greater penetration of the truth, whereas the Roman instinct of the Greco-Roman is to always keep things the same. It's extremely conservative, always maintaining that same fundamental thing. And this is the essence of doctrinal development, which is, as St. Augustine says, beauty ever ancient, ever new. That's what doctrinal development is, sort of in a pithy saying, really, because it is new, but it's also ancient. It's the same but different but the same. And what we see is that we see in these different doctrinal controversies. In my book, I identify these 4 Greco-Roman renewals. And we sort of identify how doctrinal development worked in these different renewals, because there is a pattern, I believe. And we can see this pattern in our own day. And we're sort of in this 4th Greco-Roman renewal. But what happens is there's sort of this Greek party who's following this Greek instinct, which I call in the book the moderate party. They're moderate because they want to adopt something new in order to preserve what was handed down. So the conspicuous example is we just celebrated St. Athanasius, who adopts a new term, homoousios, which is a really big innovation. It's applying a Greek philosophical terminology. It's applying these things that are not contained in the scripture. It's a total innovation, but it's doing so in order to preserve something. Now, opposed to that, then, are the strict party, the Roman party, that is opposed to any innovation whatsoever. But the key here is that both of these parties need each other, because if the party that wants innovation goes too far, then they become heretics. They're just, so new that it's totally different. Whereas the strict party, if they go too far, then they become schismatics and Donatists and Tertullian and this sort of thing, where it's, it's so conservative that it will completely
or even heretics in their own right, because had homoousios been rejected at Nicaea, you may have ended up with some version of soft Arianism as the default position of the church.
Yeah. So then I identify what is the cultural meaning of Arianism, because this is fascinating. Because when we look at this and we take theology and how theology is incarnated into the cultus, because it ultimately is the cultus itself, the ritual is, in every culture, it is a manifestation of the metaphysical beauty of logos. And in our case, it is logos incarnate. And so the cultus then informs the entire culture. And so this is where we see the social aspect of Arianism. We see that the social aspect of Arianism is an attempt to dethrone Christ as king. It's an attempt by the emperors to basically retain their status as the Son of God and the high priest, to control and maintain society as pagan and maintain their pagan morals. Because if Christ is not homoousios with the Father, then Christ is not truly king, and the emperor can kind of maintain his Son of God status. And so we see that how heresy is, all these different forms are ultimately efforts and machinations of the evil one to try to maintain the status quo of paganism. So that's just the first Greco-Roman renewal, and we go through number 2 and number 3 and all these different things, and then ultimately this 4th that we're a part of, which I would date towards beginning especially with the 19th century French patristic renewals, beginning with Ming and all these new patristic sources, which is beginning, and also the biblical resources that are totally unprecedented. In the midst of this counter-revolutionary period against liberalism. So, and we're just in this intense crisis period, which I date till 1773, really, in terms of this liberal outgrowth. So yeah, go ahead.
Well, I would just okay. Let's look, we've been talking now only for about 15 minutes, so that's great. We've got the first Greco-Roman renewal. I like that very much. I like this leitmotif of going through various iterations. I mean, a word that came to mind was creative fidelity. That this is part of the development of doctrine is you are both creative yet you are faithful to what has been handed on. And so there is that dynamic. I was also reminded that even in living organisms, you see it's so organic development over time, regardless of what one thinks, for example, of the biological theory of evolution. Even most evolutionists would acknowledge that the tendency of nature over vast periods of time is to stay the same. I mean, that's the purpose of DNA replication, is that you want to hand on these traits, these traits, these traits. And I mean, you see, alligators have been the same for 65 million years and haven't really evolved that much. Maybe they got a little smaller or something. But in the midst of that stasis, in the midst of that conservation, biological organisms do, in fact, once in a while mutate in beneficial ways. And so you get these changes. And that's the way things develop organically over time. So I think it's not only philosophically true, it's and theologically true. I think there's a great, grand, almost cosmic truth embedded in this notion of creative fidelity, of development through stasis over time, with gradual change. But anyway, we can come back to that. Let's go on then to talk about you sort of have made alluded to the French Revolution, and I know a lot of thinkers who posit, obviously it's kind of a dangerous game to say it's at this point that modernity is born and not in any other point. And so we're not making that claim. But certainly 1773, which is, kind of before the main French Revolution, but still both on the, in the Anglo world in the United States and later in the French, something is brewing here in the late 18th century that creates the modern world. So maybe let's talk about that. Let's talk about the rise of the modern world and what you say about it in your book.
Sure. Well, I there's a lot of aspects to the text which are things that are dealt with that are not really emphasized elsewhere. And one of the things that um, I see is the reason I have 1773 to me as the beginning of modernity is because that's the suppression of the Jesuits.
Yeah,
And the reason
exactly.
why is that? Why do I put it that way? I think because really the Jesuits are at the front line of the Counter Reformation, and it's they are at the front line of evangelizing the whole world and implementing the Council of Trent everywhere. And obviously, there are other orders who are doing great things in many places. But the suppression of the Jesuits allows for the liberal. It sort of opens the door for the liberal revolutions because it's after the Jesuits are suppressed that these various secular forces are able to seize the Jesuit libraries and the Jesuit educational institutions and begin to impose their public schooling and all sorts of things like that, which are really just liberal methods of mass propaganda, which subsumes the family as the primary educator and makes the state the primary educator. And I view that as there's sort of this brewing effort to destroy the Jesuits for decades before that. And obviously the Jesuits had their own issues, and these were just pretexts. They took these issues and they used them as pretext to suppress the Jesuits, obviously. But I view this as sort of this beginning of the liberal revolution because it's sort of this first blow against the Council of Trent, and I would view modernity as the final push to wipe away Baroque civilization, which was born out of the Council of Trent, and bring about something totally different where the Protestant civilizations are no longer trying to vie to create a Protestant civilization. They've lost, basically. They realize that they lost that
Yeah.
battle. The Protestants didn't succeed in creating a counter Reformation. They didn't succeed. They failed. So the fallen angels saw that they had to create something totally new. And the main thing that I define about modernity is that it is intrinsically anti-culture. And I think this is critically important because many people today talk about, oh, our culture this, our culture that. But I say that it is intrinsically anti-culture. And what I mean by that is it suppresses the public cultus of society, which is totally unheard of. The Protestants had that before. The Anglicans had a public cultus. It suppresses the fundamental fulcrum of culture, which is parents, veneration of elders, and passing down the tradition, because the Protestants had that too. But modernity flips everything on its head. And it says we're going to have constant revolt against parents. So every new generation is revolting against the prior generation. And that's the very essence. It's liberalism. It's liberation from your parents, liberation from authority itself. And this is fundamentally anti-culture. It's like matter and antimatter. There's culture and there's anti-culture. So now we have the birth of something totally different because, as I said, the Protestant cultures, they had a diminished and fragmented Christian culture, but they still had what I call the four elements of culture, from drawing on Christopher Dawson, which I have already mentioned a few of them, the cultus, the elders, for example. So the Protestants had a diminished form of culture, but modernity actually forms this new thing called anti-culture. And anti-culture, it's like poison in every single culture. You just put it in a culture and it destroys the culture eventually.
Yeah.
And this is what ultimately results in individual people becoming automatons so that the government can just control you. Because culture is really that power of the people in a true sense of the word, which creates the culture. So I think that is that essence, is this anti-culture, which I see in 1773, but then with the different liberal revolutions, they're all just implementing the same thing. And then Marxism and feminism are just outgrowths of that exact same spirit of anti-culture and revolt against culture itself.
Yeah, I mean I think that's spot on, and I also think that a philosopher like Nietzsche is so important because he is one of the very few sort of secular atheistic philosophers who really did see quite clearly, quite perspicaciously, what the full logical entailments of liberalism are. And he had the courage to sort of see that through. My friend who used to work for Ward on Fire, Robert Mixa, is big on Nietzsche in this regard, in understanding this revolution that is upon us. But also, the late great Italian philosopher Augusto Del Noce articulated a view of modernity very similar to what you just said, where modernity is characterized essentially by simply the rolling back of tradition, the rolling back of everything that's been received. And therefore, modernity is essentially a transgressive reality that it's a very parasitical reality, therefore, because it constantly needs some sort of limit against which to kick, over which to transgress, and which is why it is so toxic once it is into the veins of culture, because it's essentially a culture destroying bacterium. That's its whole ideology. So all you're left with, I like what you said, all you're left with is simply the kind of automaton. In the name of the freedom of the individual, we're going to liberate you from all of these constraints given to you by cult and family and culture and so on. We're going to liberate you from all that. And then you're going to be reduced to absolutely nothing. And now we're going to control you. And we're going to control you now through big tech and COVID pandemics and whatever. And I'm not saying that COVID was invented by the government, but I'm saying
we got a strike on YouTube right there.
Yeah, we did. I don't want to get banned from YouTube. I don't, but I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. All I'm saying is governments these days never miss an opportunity. There's not a crisis that goes to waste as an opportunity to extend the reach of government. And I don't want to get off topic. I want to get back to your book, but I'll just say in this regard, because it supports your claim about the automaton that we've become. I never dreamed in a million years in 2020 that the governor of the state of Pennsylvania, where I live, had the power and the authority with the stroke of a pen to close everything. And I mean everything: churches, schools, businesses, liquor stores. I mean, except for grocery stores and maybe pharmacies. I didn't realize all he had to do was to declare a health emergency, or the legislature just had to declare a health emergency. And all of a sudden, the government has these pluripotent powers to do whatever the heck he darn well felt like. And so it just does seem to me that one of the latent tendencies in modernity, one of the crises we face, is that the only limiting principle in government is given to us by government. D.C. Schindler makes this point in his book, The Politics of the Real, that even in the area of religious freedom is a domain carved out for us quite graciously by our governmental overlords. And thus the principle of self-limitation in government is no principle of self-limitation at all. In the very act of thus limiting itself, the government is asserting a quite expansive power. It's quite expansively saying, and we are the ones that decide what our limits are, not you. Whereas you, following Christopher Dawson, all right, and this is why I love that you follow Christopher Dawson, the authority bubbles up from below through the natural pre-state sort of givens, like family, like God, like church, like these mediating institutions, like cult and cultus, which is why the liturgical debates are very important. Which is why, Peter Kwasniewski is not incorrect to draw our attention to the importance. Anyway, I'm kind of rambling all over the place. Do you have any reactions to all my ramblings that I just sort of tossed out there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is what Cardinal Ratzinger said. He said that the liturgy cannot become where the community creates itself, because then
That's right.
it completely negates the whole purpose of what a cultus is, because the cultus came before my grandparents existed, and they passed it down to me, and that's what creates our whole community and presents itself to us, because it's a participation in this the cultus itself, the manifestation of the beauty of logos in sound and sight, and that's what it is passed down to us. So we cannot there was actually a I can't remember if it was in Comme la Poivroie, but the original document in 1969 that came out by Concilium, Comme la Poivroie, which was the translation principles when it was first translation, the Novus Ordo. I can't remember if this is in that document or just said by them, but what they wanted to do was they wanted to have every new generation translate a new vernacular mass, so it would constantly be relevant. But that negates. I mean, that's the very. They really did want every new community to invent itself, basically. There's this great desire to make the liturgy relevant to modern man by making it more pedestrian and less sacred and more profane in the sense of everyday life. It needs to be in the everyday life. And there is a truth to that in the sense that everything needs to be sacralized. But if you don't have the initial cultus in place, passed down, you don't have culture itself, then the next generation just really does invent itself. And then we have ugly churches where people are trying to invent themselves. They're trying to invent their own monuments instead of preserving what came before and then creating something new on that foundation. Now we have this is what we have. But like, when you use the framework of culture provided to us by Christopher Dawson, the framework of culture, where there's cultus and there's tradition, which is passed down, which is just the greater explanation of what cultus is. And you have the elders, the parents and the various elder offices. And then you have piety, where the next generation has piety towards what was come before. You see what happened in this crisis that we faced ourselves in Roman Catholicism in Western Europe and the Americas, as we had a generational break in this generational passing down. There's been this intense war against this whole process by the anti-culture of liberalism and her ugly daughters, feminism and Marxism. But we finally had a generation that kind of bought into that, both clerics and lay people, who wanted to break. They wanted to break with that whole transition process and create themselves anew, like the what I say, the suburban right Ash Wednesday song, what is it, Offering of Ashes, we create ourselves anew, was one of the
Yeah,
lyrics.
yeah.
So they did want to create themselves anew, and now we have this generational break, because now people of various generations are no longer connected with this sort of isolated generation. They isolated themselves because they wanted to create themselves anew. And so now we do have this. I mean, one of the greatest tragedies that I mentioned in my book, this greatness of Karol Wojtyła in fighting the communists in Poland, in Nowa Chata, the utopian dystopian communist city that
Yeah,
they
yeah.
created, is such a glorious history for Karol Wojtyła. But then they end up creating this ugly church in Nowa Chata. It's a great tragedy, because that church is a great monument to this awesome struggle of Karol Wojtyła. But unfortunately, this church it's very isolated in terms of its
Well, it seems to
monumental
follow the
power.
sort of, it does seem to follow, right, the sort of brutalist tradition
Yes.
of bare concrete and all that. And I don't know to what extent Wojtyła was an advocate of architectural brutalism or not.
I don't
But
really know. Yeah.
I agree with you. I remember seeing pictures of it and thinking, dear Lord in heaven, that's an ugly church. But let's stay on liturgy for a second, because what's fascinating to me is it's a sort of case study and everything that sort of is kind of gone wrong in so many ways. One of the things that gets neglected, I think, is the extent to which the concept of liturgy as something that's essentially inherited, and it can be reformed, it can develop. Yeah. I believe the old liturgy should have been reformed and developed a little bit, tweaked a little bit, so on. Fine. But it essentially has to be still something received. There's a democratizing element to that, because it is something common to all that we all receive, and therefore, in a sense, transcends factions, transcends so on. But what you get then with the Novus Ordo, and I have no huge issues with the Novus Ordo, unlike Dr. K. Nevertheless, the bigger problem that I have with it is that it's a pure invention. That really does seem to have been the product of a few elites. All right, I don't know how many Catholics are around in the world around 1970, maybe about 1 billion, and yet for those 1 billion Catholics who were worshiping in this received way that sustained the cultus, you get a new liturgy, very contrived, that was probably produced by about 30, 40, elite theologians in Rome or something, without any consultation, and foisted on the whole church. And that reminds me too, then, when you talk about, oh, we need each parish to sort of develop its own liturgy and its own translation, or each diocese or whatever. Well, let's remember what you're essentially saying there. What you're essentially saying is, we're going to turn management of the liturgy over to about 10 people. And those 10 people are going to be trained at some liturgy workshop run by Sister Skippy Toes. And there's going to be a cactus in the water font before long. And yeah, and maladroit octogenarians in diaphanous dresses with streamers doing liturgical dance that everyone's embarrassed by, nobody wants, but the 10 people that run things decided for all of us that this is the garbage that we're going to get. I know I'm on a bit of a rant, but that's, I think your insight here, following Dawson, following Augustine, following others, is so vitally important to understand that the faith is something received and passed on creatively but faithfully. And what we're getting instead is this revolution of the few over the many. That's my take on
Yes, I mean, I wholeheartedly agree with what you're saying. There was this is what I mean by unpacking the ideological history, is that before there was a spirit of Vatican II, there was a false spirit of Vatican I. This is one of the chapters in my book.
Yes.
And this is where there is an excessive ultramontanism, or what I would call uber ultramontanism, and clericalism, which begins in various ways. So like Pius IX, for example, or Leo XIII and Pius X, begin to create a very clericalist church. And now, to be fair, the lay order was already destroying itself, because the lay order was being, doing the liberal revolutions. So the lay order was breaking with the clergy already. The clergy were breaking from the laity, And by the time we get, and we have precedents with Pius X, but by the time we get to the Novus Ordo, we have this utter disconnect between the way that the laity are worshiping and passing down their faith and their piety, and the way that a few of the clergy want all the laity to worship. And combined with all of these different forces and excesses in the context of a constant revolution over and over, and after a worldwide bloodbath which destroys civilization all over the place, we have this imposition first under Pius XII, but then under Paul VI, of a, instead of, I mean, if they wanted to introduce some new forms into the liturgy, why not make it optional? Why not say, well, we rediscovered this sacramentary, which has all these prayers, which we think are great.
Yeah.
Well, at the cathedral, we'll have we'll have a 3 p.m. Gelasian sacrament or whatever mass with XYZ things that we're adding on, and the laity can go to that if they feel
right,
they fed by that, or that's they're edified, or they're experiencing God. But it's an utter disregard for the cultural transmission that's already happening with the laity, passing down their faith and their piety. For example, like the Good Friday traditions of the 7 last words of Christ, or visiting the different altars, these various pieties, or these various lay led processions in through the streets, all sorts of lay piety. These things are attacked ultimately by a liturgical reform which does not allow those things anymore, and says you have to only do it this way because that's what's good for you. And it's ultimately, it's kind of taking on unfortunately, I must say, sort of a Marxist style governmental overreach. We're going to force this on you because it's good for you. You're going to like it. Trust us. And it would be one thing if it was optional. Pius XII promulgated his Psalter as an option. That's great wisdom. It was completely rejected. Nobody went for it. It was an utter failure.
Yeah.
And so Pius XII didn't, in his wisdom, did not impose that on nobody. No pope since have imposed that on the church, except we do have the new Liturgy of the Hours. But created an optional thing, which, seen if it were, that's sort of a true. I would consider that to be at least one factor in the liturgical form which is necessary if we're going to reintroduce something which may have value. Okay, that's, in theory, that's okay, but we can't upset that cultural transmission. We have to organically integrate that into the cultural transmission. And if it gets passed on to the next generation, that's evidence that there may be something there. There may be some value there for the culture going forward.
I think that's all true, and a very astute analysis of where we are. I'm thinking, this attack on popular piety is still going on today. I was just a couple weeks ago, I guess, I was reading the article, about the Eucharistic pilgrimages, and one of those pilgrimages, in light of this is the year of the Eucharist revival and stuff. One of those wanted to go through the Archdiocese of Chicago, and the pilgrimages involved, the Blessed Sacrament being in a monstrance under a canopy, like a Corpus Christi procession. And Cardinal Supich forbid it. He did not want the Eucharist in a monstrance being paraded around Chicago. It had to be, they could go on pilgrimage, but it had to be in a ciborium. It had to be concealed and reserved. It couldn't be in the monstrance. And the reason that his spokesperson gave was the usual bogus recrudescence of 1970s BS about, well, the Eucharist is about fellowship and receiving Christ there at the Mass, and we don't want Eucharistic adoration piety to eclipse that and be what nonsense. What absolute sociological and psychological nonsense. Popular Eucharistic piety increases our devotion to the Mass. All the statistics show this. Where there is a vibrant Eucharistic adoration community, there is a vibrant Eucharistic communion period and community period. But it only goes to show what I want to come back to then, how political this has become. You mentioned before, right? The politics of this. And I want to go back to Augusto Del Noche again. Del Noche said that the essence, and you keep bringing up the word Marxist, which I think is perfect, because Del Noche says the essence of totalitarianism is when you gut culture of its culture, and you subsume it to the dictates of politics. So when culture becomes absolutely subservient to the political domain, that's when culture is lost, and you're essentially in a totalitarian system of some kind. Even if it's not a police state or an autocratic single ruler state, you are in a kind of totalitarian state. And my point would be that we are seeing a kind of creeping totalitarianism in the Catholic Church, precisely in and through synodality, because synodality is an attempt once again to simply co-opt the culture of Catholicism and to have imposed upon it instead by a few liberal ideological elites this theology from the 1970s that nobody actually believed in, and didn't gain any traction, but now is being attempted. I know I'm really putting a mouthful into your thesis here, and you are free to agree or disagree.
There
But
we go.
I think this is what's at stake here. What do you think?
Well, I mean, absolutely, I completely agree. And my book asserts that, going back to the very beginning of this whole conversation, is that the sort of the Greek party, the moderate party, and then the Roman party, the strict party of Christendom, these two parties that form in a crisis situation, or in the case of the Second Greco-Roman renewal, even in a peacetime, but these different forces that form. There was first the Roman strict council, which was Vatican I, where even the moderates were alienated. Cardinal Newman called the Ultramontanes at the council the tyrant majority, and so even these sort of moderate voices were isolated. And what happened was there was a breakdown of this creative fidelity, this true dynamic synthesis between these two parties. So that at Vatican II, and things happen, obviously, like the 1940s, there's new developments, obviously, that dialogue that breaks down. But then at Vatican II, there's this sort of open animosity that comes, it bubbles out of the surface. So at Vatican II, the strict party has to turn on the defensive, because the strict party, with exceptions, of course, has sort of persecuted the moderate party for decades. And so now the moderate party joins forces to a degree with the liberal party. Now, to a degree, they didn't know exactly what they were getting themselves into, but to a degree they did. Even before the council in 1960, Joseph Ratzinger is condemning Hans Küng right before the council. But we have this sort of overall what Wiltgen called the European alliance at Vatican II, which is sort of the loose conglomeration between what would become known as Communio and what would become known as Concilium. But there's sort of a loose alliance between these two forces, even though they're totally different. They're completely diametrically opposed to each other. They have sort of superficial similarities, but they end up uniting to some degree against the strict Curia party. And because of this, ultimately, the heretical party begins to triumph during the council and after the council. And this force that was unleashed, not really by Vatican II per se, but by the situation where these forces were breaking down, which had already begun back in Vatican I and before, we're finally sort of reaping the fruit of that under this pontificate with the Synod on Synodality, where these forces, as you say, the octogenarian 1970s hippies, are finally sort of having their day. Because Paul VI sort of let them go a bit, even though he would pay lip service against them. John Paul II was obviously opposed to them, Benedict even more so, and then Pope Francis has taken out of all those people. The Holy Father has taken away those institutional power structures that were developed under John Paul II, and now these people are having their power once again. And I would say, I assert that ultimately this is the result of this breakdown between these two orthodox parties that should be synthesizing together against the heretics.
I think that's a very astute sort of thumbnail sketch of what was going on at Vatican II and beyond. In defense of the kind of Communio camp, de Lubac, you're right. There was cooperation. I actually believe if I'm not mistaken, that De Lubac was for a time a part of Concilium. And it was only, it didn't take long for him to see the handwriting on the wall, and he left and started communio with Ratzinger and Balthasar, and a few others. But the fact is, I think the communio folks never, even though they knew there were problems in the theology of people like Kung and Skillebeck, I don't think they thought in a million years that the ecclesiastical edifice of the church, her authority, her magisterium, would allow it to spin out of control as it did. I think that so many of them just thought, well, the Pope will put a stop to this, or the Pope will put a stop to that, or our bishops will certainly speak up and won't let Skillebeck's views win the day. And then they all wake up, and it's 1967, and the Dutch have lost their minds, and the French have lost their minds, and all of a sudden the church is spinning out of control. And so, yeah, all of a sudden the barn door is already open. The horses are out, and you've got Ratzinger and Wojtyła and De Lubac and even Maritain and people trying to shut the stupid barn door. It's too late. The horses are out. And so it's a real problem. And so I agree with you. There is now a need for that old curial party, as you call it. Like Matthew Meinert, Matt Levering, guys like this are trying to sort of retrieve some of that neo-scholastic stuff, and that now represented more by a kind of resurgent Thomistic school by people like Feingold and Father Thomas Joseph White and scholars like this. But we really do need, I think, to make common cause against this resurgence of absolute silliness. It's interesting to go back to your, not to dominate the conversation, but this is all just so fascinating. Go back to your phase one of the Greco-Roman thing. I would say, to push your analogy even further, I would say, for example, the Roman party would have been like the curial guys, the neo-scholastics, true. And the good Greek party, the Greek party that would be the modern equivalent of those who embraced homoousios, would have been a De Lubac or a Ratzinger or somebody like that. Okay. But then you get, I think, then you mentioned before, the emperor and those aligned with the emperor who wanted Arianism to win the day for largely political reasons, in order to marginalize the absolute singularity that is Christ. I would see that as actually the liberals after the council, who I think were more interested in certain political ends than they were in strictly ecclesiological or Christological aims. Kung, in particular, was very open about the fact that his aim was a kind of world religions Catholicism that was then going to be part of this new religion of man, that would be part of this big solidarity of a movement towards a one world, solidarity of humanism and so forth. And I see that as essential reduction of the gospel to political ends, much like the emperor. Let's marginalize Christ and make him one savior figure among many, so we can essentially demote Catholicism and create this witch's brew of religions in line with the United. And now I really do sound like a tinfoil hat conspiracy nut. But anyway, what do you think of me tying those two things together?
Yeah, absolutely. There's really the what I view as what I do in the book is I present the ancient Roman gods as just being sort of reincarnated in every new crisis.
Yeah.
So we have the Roman goddess of libertas, which is liberty, which was established after the overthrow of Tarquin the Proud and the kingdom of Rome to the Republic of Rome. On the other hand, we also have the Dionysian Liber, which is sort of the lust, the fornication, the murder, the letting forth of everything. And we see how there are these different manifestations of these same sort of spiritual forces, which I would attribute to the fallen angels in various periods, which are ultimately the fallen angels are seeking to find men of power or politics and cut a deal with them and say, this whole world I will give you if you bow down and worship me, so that they then construct new idols, so that we have, just as in the ancient world, we have the real goddess of libertas. Now we have in the American Empire, we have literally an idol modeled directly off of libertas in New York City called the Statue of Liberty. And it's
Yeah.
not a true Christian liberty. It's a liberalism liberty. It's a license is what that is.
Yeah.
And it's an idol. Uh, and ultimately the powers of this world are seeking to erect idols so that the elites can have their power and the demons can have their worship. And so all the people can worship these idols. So during Vatican II, it's just, I mean, we have the two largest empires of the day, the American Empire and the Soviet Empire, are both attempting to erect their idols, which will give cultus to the false gods, the demons. And these liberal forces that you mentioned are trying to serve them. They're trying to serve the idols because they're just embarrassed to be Catholic. They're feeling so
Yeah.
inferior
Yeah.
to all these different, because they've drunk in all the various propagandas about all sorts of different scientism and etc. And you see this in Vatican II. You have bishops getting up and saying, "Oh, well, we should allow contraception because, that we don't want another Galileo case. It's too which is just a chalked up myth about that whole thing, propagandized by the Anglican Empire."
Yeah.
But we have essentially these new idols, and I think one of the things that I bring out in the book a lot is the idol of the love of money, which is the new insight into idolatry, which is given in the New Testament. Whereas before in the Old Testament, we have all sorts of idols, but in the New Testament, we say that the love of money is an idol. And we see it suggests based on this that our Lord's cleansing of the temple was a cleansing of idols, and the idol of money, the idol of the
Yes.
love of money. And
Yes.
then we see in the history of Christendom how the love of money as an idol seeks to poison Christendom. And in particular, one of the histories that I bring out that's really not really brought out elsewhere is the curse of Ham ideology, which is this heresy which is used to promote racial slavery, first by the Muslims in their trans-Saharan slave trade, and then later the Christians succumb to the love of money and they begin the transatlantic slave trade. And this is just a poison. It's a poison of the love of money and subordinating and destroying human families for the sake of this love of money. And then at Vatican II, we see, especially with the American Empire, we have the love of money, the promotion, the worldwide promotion of the love of money through various ideologies that are very subtle. But at the same time, the Soviet Empire is the same thing. They have the love of money because their whole ideology is based on power. If you don't have power, if you're poor, you're nothing. You have to, create this mass movement of violence and revolution because you don't have money. It's still the love of money in a different way from a different coin. But I agree with your analysis with that.
Well, I think that's very astute. I think obviously, since I run a Catholic worker farm as well as being like a communio theologian and blogger, I'm very much on board with your notion of the corruptions of money, corruptions of mammon. I'm reminded of a great book that came out like 3 or 4 years ago now by Eugene McCarraher at Villanova University called The Enchantments of Mammon. And it's essentially written as a book against the disenchantment thesis of Max Weber and other sociologists in the early 20th century who claimed that secularism and the rise of modernity represented essentially a disenchantment of the world, the demystification of the world. And McCarraher said, well, that's true in one sense. There's there's a disenchantment of the higher gods of Christianity, and so on. But human beings being incorrigibly religious animals, we're going to worship something. And McCarraher then goes through this whole history, points out what we worship is money. So we're not a disenchanted culture at all. We're highly enchanted, and our enchantment is a really bad enchantment called Mammon. And obviously, he's very negative about it. And so that I like the fact that you tie certain developments within the church to this corruption of Mammon. So I was wondering, let's see, what time is it? Okay, we've been going about 50 minutes. We can go for, if you have time, we can go a little longer.
Yeah, go ahead.
It took us long enough to get this interview. So come on, let's not be parsimonious here, time-wise. So let's talk a little bit about then the development of doctrine. And I think you mentioned in your introduction that you kind of tie notions of development of doctrine into your thesis here. Obviously, the church has taught some things from the past, like Pope Leo and Exsurge Domine, that, it's okay to burn heretics at the stake and so on. And we mentioned slavery. It seems to me, I'm kind of ignorant on the topic, to be perfectly honest with you. But the little that I've read on the topic, it seems to me that the church's magisterium was kind of all over the map in terms of slavery, not slavery, it's okay, tolerated, not okay. So, in other words, let's use some of these issues as a kind of springboard to sort of define what is creative fidelity, what is this Greek and Roman dynamic as we look at the development of doctrine.
Yeah, and this is a complicated subject, especially some of these explosive topics that are contained in the book. But I would say what I argue in the book is that there is this creative tension between these two parties that we've already identified. But the key is that there is a dialogos between them. There's a dialogos which joins them together so that neither one of them goes too far, but they create this synthesis against the heretics, which is ultimately a continuation of logos, because it is not only manifesting logos incarnate, but it is manifesting logos incarnate according to logos itself, according to the ordering of the thing itself, so that it is new and old at the same time. The key point in the Arian crisis that I say is, because there was homoousios, there was the doctrine of Nicaea promulgated, but after that, there was a massive crisis with all sorts of different Arian groups. But there was also a anti-Nicene party, which was Orthodox, because they objected. They were the Roman instinct. They objected to the fact that there was this new thing happening. And Saint Athanasius shows his magnanimity in 362. Under Julian the Apostate, ultimately all these different manifestations of Arianism have run their course, and God sends his wrath in the form of Julian the Apostate, which renews the pagan persecution. And St. Athanasius, because he's such a great saint, he says, well, I'm going to take the opportunity to have this dialogos, where we're going to join forces with this Nicene party. We're going to win them over, because by dialogos, meaning I'm going to talk to you as a brother, and I'm going to actually cut through the superficiality of the terminologies that we're using and find out what the substance really is. And you can only do that through a true dialogos. And what he does is he wins over this anti-Nicene party to the homoousios, to Nicaea, which ultimately results in the victory of Nicaea and especially after 381. But this is what helps to understand the breakdown of the other Greek schisms after the Council of Ephesus and Chalcedon, and also with the Fifth Ecumenical Council, where there are these different Greek parties which are battling over terminology. Some of them are fighting only for terminology, but some of them are actually heretics. And so we have to actually distinguish between who's who here. But what happens is there's such a bitterness, such an immense bitterness that results that dialogos breaks down. That whole structure that is necessary to create that synthesis, it breaks down. And Christopher Dawson says the invasion of Islam is the wrath of God for this breakdown of Christendom right here. It's the wrath of God. God gave them over to a foreign party, just like he did in the Old Testament. Because there is not that Roman instinct and the Greek instinct working together, so that there can be a truth synthesis, a true dialogos, which gets through that. So it works in the particular case, whatever it is. What does that actually look like? It depends on this dialogos, but it takes a different form in the second Greco-Roman renewal, which is really a synthesis between the Augustinians, like the Franciscans, like St. Bonaventure, who are retaining what came before. And then you have the innovator is St. Thomas Aquinas. So he wants to bring in Aristotle, and he wanted to put Aristotle to bear on Christendom, and that's really controversial. Wow, pagan philosopher, what are you doing with that guy? But because he's a synthesizer, and because there is this dynamic, there's this truly synthesizing dialogos between these Orthodox parties, and there is a Roman magisterium who is making sure nobody goes outside the bounds of orthodoxy. That's how we have the greatness of what I call first Christendom, not the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages is a Marxist term itself, not Marxist per se, but it's an anti-Christian term. We shouldn't use Middle Ages. That was invented by the enemies of Christ. Yeah. We should use Christendom or first Christendom, or I call first Western Christendom, because there's other Christendoms. And that's what the glory of this period is, and that's happening not even in a massive heretical crisis in those years, 1100s, 1200s, 1300s. And that's what builds the greatness of Western Christendom, is this true dialogos between these different parties who are just they're sort of competing with one another for the glory of God. It's like when St. Bonaventure and St. Thomas Aquinas appear before the Pope, and they've both written a Eucharistic hymn, and St. Bonaventure hears, they're these bitter rivals, who bitterly disagree with each other. And yet St. Bonaventure, when he hears the Eucharistic hymn of St. Thomas Aquinas, he rips up his own and he says, yours is better, glory to God. Like that's the true spirit of this true dynamic of competing for the greater glory of God.
That's fantastic, and I think that is a great story about Bonaventure and Aquinas, and I think, though, I mean, it goes to show that any true development of doctrine has got to have that spirit of ecclesial sacrifice within it, ecclesial devotion within it. Development of doctrine cannot be animated by external ideological forces and factors, which are almost always just greatly distorting influences. I mean, all that said, there is a sense in which I think we have not yet fully come to grips with what, at least for a lot of people. I think a Newman dealt with it, Blondel dealt with it, Vincent Leblarin dealt with it way back when. But a lot of average Catholics today seem to be of the opinion that there is either a strict material continuity in all doctrines in the history of the church, and that all discontinuities can be simply explained away, or there is wicked, massive rupture everywhere, which legitimates all kinds of either schism or liberal theological dissent. And of course, then you've got Pope Benedict talking about a hermeneutic of reform in his criteria for determining development of doctrine, that there's going to be little micro ruptures or discontinuities in the service of a deeper continuity, and so on. And it just really confuses a lot of people, right? So in other words, do you subscribe basically to Cardinal Newman's concept of development of doctrine, or do you subscribe to some other version?
I mean, I would say that he's getting at a substantial truth thereof.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think the fundamental, what I would assert in this text, is that the fundamentals of Christian culture are these four elements from Dawson, and that the doctrinal development has the main, I mean, one of the main factors, I guess I would call it, is that there needs to be this generative continuity. That's the main continuity, is that it has to go slow enough so that the general 25 years of a generation growing from age zero to age 25 and creating a new family and passing it down, then is that it cannot rupture that whole process. It has to go slow enough so that the whole process is continuous. There's no disruption of the entire cultural framework, so that doctrinal development can happen. But nowadays we have international business targeting children, and they're targeting children, which takes them out of that whole generative process. Yeah. And what we talked about before about the liturgists, they're imitating that whole pattern because they're targeting the children. They're saying, oh, we're going to touch this new generation who's 10 years old, 15 years old, or, the youth. We're going to reach the youth. But you've already disconnected the whole cultural paradigm by doing that, because you have to reach father and son and grandfather. You have to have all three of those together. And that's how you enter into that doctrinal development. So I would say Newman is getting at this from a theological perspective. And he's, I think there's a substantial truth to that. But where does the real test? I mean, where does the rubber meet the road with that? I would say it meets the road. Can it maintain that generative continuity so that it can really truly develop? Because that's the only. I mean that this is what is the youth rise up and they add a new zeal to the wisdom of our fathers. Our fathers passed down the wisdom, and the youth add a new zeal to that wisdom. And that's, I mean, that I would summarize doctrinal development like right there. There's a new zeal to the same wisdom, and it comes from the youth. But the youth, as the prophet says, I will turn the hearts of their fathers to their children, and the children to their fathers. That's the true doctrinal development. So if and only if that can happen. I mean, there's a disconnect. One of the things about Vatican II, which is unfortunate, is that I think that there was a great disconnect between lots of theologians, even good theologians who have good theological ideas, who are creating a good doctrinal development in theory. They may be disconnected from the reality of the parishioners on the ground and what they're experiencing, and how would that, for example, I think religious liberty is a perfect example. The term religious freedom, we could create a doctrinal orthodoxy. We can create a box where that's doctrinally orthodox among the theologians, but the reality is that we have a worldwide American psychological manipulation of that term for the ends of politics. And so the people on the ground, they have an understanding of what that means based on the American CIA propaganda, not according to what theologians have cooked up, and even that, if that's good. And so that's another disconnect. So I think that would be
I think that's very true. I mean, if you read a great big thick book put out by David L. Schindler before he died, and in conjunction with Nicholas Healy, a theologian at the JP2 Institute in Washington, and it was a big thick book about Dignitatis Humanae from Vatican II. And it was essentially an attempt to show that you can really develop a perfectly organic and orthodox understanding of Dignitatis Humanae's understanding of religious freedom, that it doesn't entail an American-style separation of church and state, or a French secularizing laïcité against clericalism. That if you look at the schemata as they flowed through the council, and this book gives you all the various different documents as they evolved, you see the influence of the French and Polish bishops, Wojtyła included, and that they wanted to root this innovation in a properly traditional framework. All that stuff, that's all great. So you're right. Dignitatis Humanae can be read in a perfectly contiguous, orthodox way, and so on. But that's not how it was read. I mean, when it hits the road on a popular level, all that gets translated in the popular media in the Western world is the Catholic Church has now embraced separation of church and state, period, end of discussion. And so now you end up with a Catholic president, a so-called Catholic president, who invokes Vatican II and the separation of church and state and religious freedom as a justification for abortion, for crying out loud. Yeah, it's a problem. And no less a light than Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict, recognized the same thing. I don't remember where he said this. It was in an interview where he said point blank, the problem with Vatican II is that we were so intent on getting the theology right that we forgot how it would be perceived on a pastoral level.
Yeah, it's in Last Testament with Peter Zavold.
Yeah, exactly.
He says we did, it's something like that. He said we did the right thing, but we didn't realize how these things would come across. We didn't realize the political implications.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's
the Savold. Yeah, that is where I read that. And he even acknowledged, I think it was in the same Savold text, I think he was at a meeting of Communio editorial board, international meeting of all the various editorial boards, where he said something similar about let's be aware as communal style theologians that we're not simply talking. And so I'm paraphrasing, but we're not simply talking to ourselves in a closed circle of theologians. We have to be constantly aware of what's going on out there in the church right now on a pastoral level. And perhaps to a certain extent, all of us theologian types have been guilty of that as we talk to each other. You know, it's probably an epidemic sin amongst most academics that they end up talking to people within their own guild, regardless of the discipline. And sadly, I think theologians fell into that as well. But anyway, okay, we've been talking now for about an hour and 40 minutes. I'm trying to think of, there was something popped into my head. I meant to write it down and now I forgot. But anyway, let's talk before we get out of here. Where do we go from here? What do we do now, Timothy? What's important? What's on your radar?
Well,
I mean, I don't interrupt. I mean, but you run
yeah,
1 Peter 5, which started
yeah,
by Steve Skojek.
yeah.
I mean, it's a sort of place where trads like to really get really pugilistic and out there, but in a good way. So obviously you believe in some form of traditionalism and so on. But anyway, so go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah, where do we go from here? Well, that's the subject of my final chapter in my book. And one, I think we've already discussed this, is that the theologians need to work on this synthesis. They need to put aside the animosity that they have felt or that they've been taught regarding that other Orthodox party. And I'm thinking in particular the recent text that was published by Matthew Meinert and John Kerwin called A Dialogue Delayed, which is all about this sort of the dialogue that failed right before Vatican II between the Roman Dominicans and other Dominicans with the ressourcement thinkers in
Yeah.
France. And the theologians, as far as they're concerned, they need to overcome that animosity and begin to interact in a true dialogos with sort of this other party, understanding, and this is already this is already happening under this pontificate, because under this pontificate there are people who are attacking both they're attacking Archbishop Lefebvre and John Paul II and Pope Benedict
Yeah.
and the Latin Mass. You know, they're just taking everything out, and everyone's kind of realizing, wow, we all need to fight together to a degree on all these basic points of doctrine. So that's as regards to the theologians, and as regards to Christian families. So, I mean, part of this book is it doubles as a homeschool textbook, or a high school textbook, so that Christian families can learn their history, because this book also upends many of the anti-Catholic myths of history, but it also provides a challenge for a high school young man or young woman to confront these crises of this day and to have a much more sound opinion to confront these things. But then either they'll go into the priesthood and then they'll join the theologians in this whole epic dialogue, or they'll become Christian mothers and Christian fathers, and they will pass down this history. And so the idea of this book is to help lay people also get out of their ideological historical paradigms, so that they are truly embracing their Catholicity and their communion with fellow Catholics who are Orthodox, even if they're in different parties and different whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
But and we touched on before, the traditionalism, the epicenter, the pyramid, the greatest aspect of the traditional movement is the preservation of the Latin Mass, the preservation of this ancient rite of Rome. So because only, and we can quote Cardinal Ratzinger, Cardinal Sarah, and other more sort of communio thinkers to say the same thing, that we have to have this central cultus for everything else to work together. And that's preserved by lay people fighting for what I would term their rights, or the rights of their children, perhaps, of their inheritance, of the Roman rite, the ancient Roman rite. And only if that is preserved, if and only if that is preserved, then we can talk about reforms and liturgical things like that. But we have to have that very thing. But Cardinal Ratzinger points out that the enemies of Christ were embarrassed in the face of the Protestants. They're embarrassed about the dogmas of Trent. They wanted to become Lutherans. That's why they hated the Latin Mass. That's why they're so bitter to take away the Latin Mass, is because they want to say that the Mass really isn't a sacrifice. Luther was right on that, actually. Let's just do away with the Latin Mass and create a brand new day. So there's a weaponization of the Novus Ordo against the Council of Trent. So where do we go from here? Is what I'm trying to get at is that this book it doubles as the Catholic transmission of culture in the domestic church, in the parish schools, to raise up that next generation. So if you're a theologian, get going on this epic dialogue, or everybody, as for the rest of us, let's get going on passing down the faith to the next generation and breaking out of these ideological barriers. And if you're a priest or bishop, we ask you to help this and be a shepherd and fight against the wolves and protect
And
us from those
I
wolves.
agree. Lately, my hobby horse has been education. I think even average lay people, if they truly are interested in passing on the faith to their kids, they have to become better educated in the faith themselves. And that means become better educated in the history of the church, the history of theology, these things. And there are books out there that can help them, like your book now can help them do this. I also think of like a book I was reading not too long ago by Tom Holland called Dominion. I don't know if you've seen this book. It's a kind of popular sort of history. I don't know how it compares to yours. And it's things like that. I think the average layperson needs to do far more reading of these kinds of materials. Avail yourselves of YouTube videos like this. Avail yourselves of various other. There's just so much stuff out there now that you can access for free, even to educate yourself. But you're not, because you're not going to pass the faith on simply through little acts of piety. You've got to have an intellectual content as well to your faith. And so I really think it's imperative that lay people become a little sort of armchair thinkers. I don't want to say necessarily theologians, but armchair thinkers about deep matters. And people are capable. Average people are capable of thinking theologically, of thinking about deeper matters. And so, yeah, I agree with you. In order to pass this cultus on, we need people to be educated about it. You and I might disagree, or not, I don't know, about whether or not what needs to be passed on is just the old Latin Mass, say pre 1955, the old Latin Mass. We just need to resurrect that and move it forward. I don't know. I'm not a liturgist. I don't know I'm not a sociologist. I don't know what kind of a World War Ecclesial 3 would break out. If for example, I think this is why Pope Benedict never just said, "Hey, look, here's the deal. The Novus Ordo is scrapped. We're bringing back the old Mass. We're putting the band back together." All right, like the Blues Brothers. I don't think that Ratzinger felt that was even remotely possible, even as Pope, for him to do, that there would just be this massive revolt. And so you get Summorum Pontificum, which says we're at least going to allow people who want to do it to do it. So which path forward do you favor? Do you hope that the next, and like in your traditionalist like fantasy world, do you hope that the next pope just comes out and says, okay, we're just going to go back to the old Mass, the Novus Ordo is out, the old Mass is in? Or do you look for a more gradual cultural change in this regard?
I mean, I would say that jettisoning the Novus Ordo and imposing the Latin Mass on everyone would be making the same pastoral mistake that Paul VI
Yes.
did when he did the every opposite of that. And the reason is because, despite its deficiencies per se, the deficiencies that are contained in the text and the rubrics of the Novus Ordo, not just its abuse, despite those things, there are places in the world, and for us in the United States, this may come as a shocker, but there are Novus Ordos celebrated in Korea and China and elsewhere where it has been passed down and there has been an organic
Yeah.
culture
Yeah.
contained there.
This is where I
And
was heading with this. So this is
yeah,
good. Go
so to
ahead.
upset that would isolate and alienate those faithful who have maintained that and created that culture. So as I said before, there needs to be a I think Pope Benedict is providing the traditional answer to this in part by reintroducing, because this whole situation to a large degree was created by an innovation. The elders in the cultural framework that I'm working with here from Dawson, you have the cultus, the tradition, and the elders and the piety. And the elders' job is to make sure that the tradition is passed down, the cultus is passed down to the next generation, and it's not to reinvent, as we discussed. But after the Protestant revolt, we have what I call in the book second iconoclasm of the Protestants everywhere. And so the Pope Pius V, found it necessary to desperate times call for desperate measures, where the Pope took it upon himself to suppress all rites which were 200 years old or newer, and impose more or less the Roman rite.
Right.
But he gave a lot of local options and local veneration of antiquity and antique rites. And that's really the traditional answer is what we should try to be seeking, is restoring that the local organic cultural right, which is a dynamic process between the lay order, who's the nobleman ruling the fiefdom, and the bishop. And because the lay order pays for the church and erects the monuments and does all these things, and the clerics celebrate the liturgy. But I would say that it's, in my trad fantasy world, I would say, I heard that the initial motu proprio that was under John Paul II, I heard this, I don't know if this is true or not, but I heard that the original version of Summorum Pontificum required every cathedral to have the Latin Mass. So that every cathedral was required to have at least one Latin Mass every weekend, but then they could also have these other things. And in my trad fantasy world, I would be seeking the pre-Tridentine local bishop subsidiarity, truly cultural liturgical reality.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which would have a vast diversity of rites, which were all very traditional, not like we have in the suburban rite Novus Ordo world, where every community is totally different but they're also sort of the same. It's like, oh, they're all the same actually. But it is a truly organic. But how do you get there? I think it is. The number one thing, the first step, is allowing the Latin Mass, and I would even require it at every cathedral. Every cathedral has to have one Latin Mass, and that creates the standard then. But then I would also say that one of the most conspicuous things for these faithful who have been worshiping at the Novus Ordo for some decades or a few generations now, is the vernacular, is praying and worshiping and hearing things that they understand, at least a lot more. And so why not draw upon the Anglican ordinariate tradition? And
that's me. I do attend an
there we go.
Anglican ordinary
Why
church.
not draw upon a sacral English, an Elizabethan English? There's a centuries old tradition of polyphony in English. Why not draw upon that? Because
we do it.
The lingua franca of the world very much is English to a great degree. So using more English as well, the sacred English, not the vulgar English, not yous and you, but these and thous, using that to create a more organic development of the liturgy. But it's unfortunately it's so difficult to do something like this because of this revolutionary period we're in, the negligence of many bishops, or the even bishops who want to actually promote this sort of liturgical deformation and iconoclasm. So it's a very difficult thing. I think ultimately we need to, like I say in this book, this is a homeschool textbook, or this is a high school textbook. It starts with the domestic church. you handle your domestic church and then you focus on your parish. That's all most of us can really worry about and should worry about, is just our domestic church and our parish, and creating that parish culture, which is truly, that true liturgical culture, pious Catholic culture. And
Yeah,
that's what out of that is where the saints arise. The saints arise out of that. And the saints will then bring us to
I
the
agree.
glorious third Christendom.
It is ironic, right? That in this supposedly wonderful new world of a synodal church of the peripheries and dialogue and so on, that the church supposedly of let a thousand flowers bloom, we're being told that the liturgy can be only one, singular, the only kind, this kind, and even within that kind, any kind of an attempt to make it slightly more traditional, bishops are saying no to altar rails, no to ad orientem, none of that stuff. You can't do any of that. So there's being imposed from above this monolithic homogeneity that is quite foreign, as you point out, to sort of the history. Even under Pius V, he allowed for certain antique rites and so on. And as someone who attends an Anglican ordinariate church myself, I'm a cradle Catholic, but I attend this church. I agree with you completely. It's ad orientem. It's receiving communion at an altar rail while kneeling on the tongue. Tons of incense, tons of polyphony, lots of chant, and elevated kind of English. The restoration of things like ember days and all this kind of thing. Uh, it's just breathtakingly beautiful, and we could take steps like that too. I live in fear that that's the next shoe to drop under this papacy, that the Anglican ordinariate will now be suppressed or something. But I think it's such a small thing in the church right now that it doesn't pose much of a threat. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. We've been now at this about an hour and a half. We should probably bring this to a close. We can always do another conversation in the future,
Certainly.
Timothy. I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. It's been fantastic. I urge everybody. Do you have a copy of your book there that you can hold up?
Oh yeah. Yep. City of God versus City of Man. I think it's reversed in my video, but
It's reversed for you, but it came through for
oh,
us.
okay, good.
So I urge all of my viewers and listeners to get Timothy Flanders' new book, City of God versus City of Man, and also my book, Confessions of a Catholic Worker, because it hits some strikingly similar themes based on what you've said here today. I don't go through a whole history like you do, but still very, very similar themes. Do you have any last words, Timothy, that you want to offer to the audience before we sign off here?
Yeah, ultimately this is part of our lay apostolate called Meaning of Catholic, and Meaning of Catholic is a lay apostolate which is seeking to promote this very thing that I described, namely
Yeah.
restoring the true rival schools of Christendom, where there can be a true dialogos, which is not merely a dialogue where we are kumbaya about nothing. It's truly a subordination to the truth, a penetration of the truth by disparate parties who are all seeking and competing for the greater glory of God. So that's what we promote at Meaning of Catholic. That's meaningofcatholic.com.
I like that. Let's end with that. We're certainly not about a kumbaya of nothing. That we want to promote the substance of the faith. And as a communio theologian, I certainly agree with that. And so I thank you for writing a book that reaches across the aisle and for coming on the show today. So thanks everybody for joining us today. And once again, get Timothy Flanders' new book, City of God versus City of Man. I think I haven't read it myself, but now I'm going to order it. I think it sounds great. So thanks a lot for being on the show today, Timothy. Thanks for everybody for listening.